Hi everybody, this is a quick tutorial and perhaps a little bit of an object lesson on using 3D software. And this really addresses the issue of if you want to create simple, quick diagrams, which is super popular these days. And as most of you probably know, the generally accepted method for doing that is to actually use Rhino and good old Make 2D. And if you just search the web, there's all kinds of tutorials out there about that. And essentially, the process is you create your three-dimensional model in Rhino. Uh, then you use the Make 2D command to flatten it down into basically a two-dimensional line drawing, and then you import that line drawing into Illustrator. So essentially, you've created solid surfaces that have color or materials or textures on it, and you strip all that away and break this down to a kind of a dumb two-dimensional drawing that doesn't have any 3D depth or information to it. And then you manually rebuild all that by applying new line weights, filling textures. As this says, the hidden lines didn't come through, or they're white, you need to change that. Use a dash line as a drafting convention in order to show that, or add other lines by hand, and then go in and fill all these surfaces so that eventually, after whatever, an hour's worth of work or however long it takes you, you come back to where you were in the first place in the 3D software. You've already got all the surfaces done. So you're kind of doing work over again. What I'm going to show you is a method that avoids that. And again, other tutorials here, just they're all over the place. This method actually is at least a little better. It's using rendering in Rhino, exporting that as a PDF, and then creating the Make 2D line drawing and combining those in Photoshop. So it doesn't have various line weights to it, or profile lines, I would say, but it's got the shading at least, and it saves a lot of extra time in Illustrator. So hopefully this might convince you that this method is worth a try. And I'm doing this in SketchUp, but you could do it in Rhino as well. So here's my little site plan. Just create a little site diagram. It has some thickness. It's got water, a road, some trees, and landform. So I'm going to show you how to go through, and this is going to use V-Ray in order to create that kind of rendering with lines. So of course the problem with this right now is if I pull up V-Ray and render this, it's going to give me a rendering of it, but there's no lines in it because V-Ray gets rid of lines. It's just using shading. And so if I put colors on here, you could see all that. And these are lobwork trees, by the way, which are amazing trees for SketchUp that you can see come in as proxies and really simple and quick, but when they render, they're high resolution. So the problem is, how do I create line weights? Because SketchUp has no Make 2D because it focuses on using 3D the way it should be. It should be used, not to create flat two-dimensional drawings, but to use the 3D model itself to create the drawings and the output that you want. So the way that you can do that using V-Ray is to use something called Toon Materials. So if I pull up the asset editor, you can see that I can come down here and make a new material, and one of those is Toon. And this is designed for cartoonists because, as you know, if you've looked at cartoons, they have simple color fills and they have lines around them, and they use line weights, heavier line weight on the profiles in order to distinguish them. So I could start right here in V-Ray. What I'm going to do first, though, is just go through and pick some colors for these different elements that are in my simple diagram: landform, buildings, roads, water, and trees. Now, the other thing that kind of helps you, I've created these boxes just as a way to kind of set up the Toon materials, and then we'll apply them. I've also taken some time beforehand just to create some layers. So I've got a layer for landforms, for buildings, for water, and for roads, and each of those particular elements are placed there. Now, another thing I did, and you'll see there is a little issue with the way the Toon materials display in SketchUp because they're procedural. They're not based on an image map like a photograph or a simple color. And there's just simply no way to display that type of procedural material in SketchUp. So it uses what's called a helper image. And so I'm going to show you a couple workarounds so you can actually see the colors that you're working with. It will render perfectly fine, but it's nicer to be able to see the basic colors. One way to do that is to simply set up your layers, get organized anyway, set the colors as to what you want, and then just click on the color by layer option. And now you can see these are the basic colors that I want to use for my Toon materials. Okay. And again, SketchUp gives me this little profile line already, but that doesn't come through in the rendering. So how do I do that? Okay, so if you want to set that up, that's an easy way to do it, but I'll show you another workaround for right now. I'll turn that off so we can actually see the colors. So let's just start with landform. I'm going to grab the paint bucket and simply come over here, go to my materials tab, and start picking some colors. So landform, let's make it a dark olive green. So I'm just going to click on that. Since this is already the default material and these are each grouped objects, I can just one click and it colors it with that color. So let's color that as well. So that's landform. Buildings, maybe something in the tan range. Okay, buildings. We've got roads, make those a light gray. Maybe silver. And water, find a nice blue. Go with steel blue. And finally, trees, we'll pick another variation of the green. Maybe forest green here. Okay, so those are the basic colors that I'm going to use. So right now I'm not going to bother applying them to here, although you could do the same thing on your original model. I'm going to use these to show you how to set up the Toon Materials. So first thing I'm going to do is click on my V-Ray Asset Editor, and you can see now that those materials are showing up in my list of colors. And this is important because in order to create a Toon material, you need a base color to apply to that Toon material. So by putting these in first, as you'll see, I have those to work with. So I'm going to come down here, click on New Material, and usually the first thing I do, it just comes up with Toon. I'm going to right click on that and say Rename. And I'll leave the Toon so I can sort them alphabetically. And I'll just call this Landform and hit Enter. So if I'll close this left flyout and open up my right flyout here, which now if I select the Toon Landform, you can see here the base material is set to none. So I'm going to set that to, that was my dark olive green. Now you can barely see a little bit of a line in the preview here. So what I need to do to make this work is and you can experiment with this in real time. I'll show you that in a little bit. So I'm going to bump this up a little bit, but what's really important is to make sure you turn on the multiply silhouette. So that says that anytime you reach the edge of an object, not an internal line, it's going to bump up that line. So I can set this up to, excuse me, maybe 1.62. Again, depends on the size of your objects and the complexity of your view. You can adjust those until it looks appropriate. Okay, and now that I have that done, I can come over here, shift select these, and I'm just going to come down, right click on that and say apply to selection. So now you can see what happened. This is what SketchUp is doing. It's displaying this. Now if I render this quickly, you can see that it's applying that line weight to the rendering. Okay, so now I've got my outlines. I don't have to do anything in Illustrator or Photoshop. Saves you a ton of time. And you can make adjustments to these and make them as complex or as interesting as you want. So it's rendering fine, but it's not displaying very well. So what I need to do is just pick up this color. So I just Alt-click on it, go to my SketchUp Materials editor, and just click on the Edit tab. And you can see that it's using this texture image called V-Ray Texture Helper. I'm going to leave Colorize checked, uncheck that. And if I really wanted this to be kind of perfect, I could go over to my color in this list and look up the RGB settings on it, and then I can, in here, instead of using the color wheel, I can go to RGB and I can type that in. I'll show you how to do that in a second. If you really want them to match exactly, that's how you can do it. So once I've done this, now you can see that my material looks about the same in here. And again, since it's the rendering, the final rendering is what's going to count. It doesn't have to actually match it perfectly. But if you wanted to, you can figure it out. You just come down here, click on dark olive green, click on the diffuse map color there. And one of the things you'll need to do, you can switch this color space here, screen, rendering, RGB, whatever that is, but this displays it in a range from 0 to 1. If you click on this, you can do standard 0 to 255. So it's 85, 107, 47. I come over here and type those numbers in, then I'll get exactly the same color, 85, 107, 46. That was a pretty good guess, if I do say so myself. one number off. There we go. Sometimes your eye is best. Okay, so if you want to edit that, you can do that in here. And once in a while, if you change something or rename something, you might see that helper image come back. You just have to go back over there and reset it, and you're done. So with that one done, let's go in and make another one. Okay, so let's come down here. Let's do a new Toon material. First thing we do, right click and rename, and we'll call that Toon Dash Buildings. Hit enter. And then I'm going to come over here, choose my base material. I believe that's Peru. Yeah. I want to turn my multiply silhouette on and bump that up closer to 2. And again, if you want to adjust the basic line width. Now this divide by distance is kind of cool also because this is something that would take you forever to do in Illustrator because this is a 3D model and it understands three-dimensional depth, which Illustrator doesn't once you make things 2D. You can check divide by distance. So if you have multiple objects, the line weights in the foreground will be heavier and it will make them lighter as it goes or thinner as they go to the background. So if you have a more complex diagram, that could be really useful in using that line weight hierarchy to represent depth within your diagrammatic image. So I'm not going to turn that on right now, but you can see that it kind of adjusts the widths up a little bit. So you can experiment with that as well. Okay, so now that we've got that set up, buildings, I'm going to come here and select this, okay, and then come back here, right click on Toon Buildings and say apply to selection. Again, you see that color got picked up that way. We're just going to alt click on that, come back over here, and I'll just go back to my color wheel. I know that's in that range somewhere, a little darker. Okay, and uncheck use texture map and leave colorize, and we've got that one done as well. So let's come down and make a Toon material for our roads. So first thing, rename it. Just put a dash, roads, enter. Come over here, look for my silver, and set my line weight up a little bit. Turn my silhouette multiplier on. I'm going to maybe make this one a little lower. I'm not sure that it'll pop out the road. I don't want too thick as it's going through there. Okay, and then I can come back into my window, select this, right click, apply to selection, get my paint bucket, alt click to pick that up, come back over here, uncheck use texture. You've got a nice gray there. That looks great. And then let's go on to our, well, let's do water. I'm not really going to worry about trees too much because they're going to render the way they are. But let's make one more Toon just to run you through it again. First thing, rename it so you keep track of these. Water, enter. Go over, and again, if the flyout's not up, you need to open the right flyout. Go up to material and say steel blue. Turn on the multiplier silhouette. Bump that up a little bit. And then come back into the model. Select that and that. Right click, apply to selection. Done. Okay, get our paint bucket. Alt click. Let's go back to our materials. Uncheck that. Shift this down to blue. There we go. It looks pretty good. All right, then we're set to go. So right now we've created all those Toon materials and we've applied them. So let's come back over to our model here. And one of the really cool things about V-Ray is its real-time render. So instead of just doing a fixed rendering, let's activate the interactive renderer. So once this gets going, we can start moving things around. And as I zoom in or out, it's just re-rendering that in real time so I can actually see what the changes are that are happening here. So for example, I have this landform over here, but I don't have any buildings, so I'm going to just select that building block and move it over here, place it in there, and there we go. So I see that outline of that building. If I want to move a copy of that up, hit Alt, I'm going to move that over a little bit. Maybe I'll open up the group, pull that down. Okay, so I can start seeing these relationships between things. Not sure why that's disappearing there, but we'll see if it'll pop back up. Let's move that, snap it to there. Okay, so let's go ahead and apply the rest of these colors. Yeah, you can see it's sitting down there a little bit lower, so let's select those two and move them up. Okay, so let's select each of our objects. So here's our water. Right click, apply selection. Now, since I have these on layers as well, I could also just say roads, right click, apply to layer, roads, and there it just got applied to it. Now, you'll notice the lines aren't showing up in this, and I'll explain why that is in a little bit. So let's go to landform, right click, apply to layer, landform. There we go. Now that's got edges around it, as you can see there. Again, we may have to start this and restart it. I'm going to get this out of the way so I have a little more room on the screen here. Let's try opening that up again. Okay, there we go. Just need to refresh that a little bit. So you can see that we've got these outlines, and I can create whatever kind of diagram I want and just simply output this at whatever resolution I need, and I don't have to do any lines. If I want to take these buildings and pull them up in the air so I can create an exploded diagram, then just use the move tool, make sure they're going straight up in the air. I could take my trees, select them the same way if I wanted to, move them up. Now there isn't a way to create the lines that you would want to spread those apart, but it's a discussion for another day. I would argue that this kind of exploded diagram is way overused and doesn't really tell you that much. You could use color coding and other methods just by taking multiple views of this. So I can see the relationships of the tree to the landform and the building to the water. Once I've exploded apart, it makes those relationships really difficult to see. So it may allow you to see the elements more clearly, but it doesn't help you see the relationship between them. Okay, so let's now deal with this walkway. The reason this isn't showing up is in SketchUp, in order to create those profile edges, things have to be grouped. And so I'm going to double click on that and make a group out of it. And as soon as I do that, you can see now the road edges are showing up. The only reason I exploded that is because the great thing about having this in 3D software is you can manipulate it in lots of ways. I have a couple sections put here, for example, so I can click on this and say make this the active cut, hide that, and SketchUp 2018 will automatically fill this in with a color for you. So I can do section perspectives. I could turn it into, I could put my section plane back on, right click and say align view, turn the camera to parallel, and now I've got a section elevation view basically that I don't I've got the lines and I've got everything else in there with really high quality trees rendered at the same time. So it just gives you a lot more flexibility to be able to create whatever views you want using the 3D software. I've got a couple different sections. I can click on this one and make that the active cut. Now you can see here, this is why I exploded that road, because in this case, because this is separated, SketchUp doesn't, it's like, hatching patterns in AutoCAD. If there's a break, it can't fill it in. And so here it's seeing that there's a break because this group is not connected. So probably the way to solve this might be just to extrude that road a little bit and leave the surface underneath of it so that SketchUp has one contiguous surface that it can cut sections through. But I just wanted to show you that you can use those kind of sections, and then when you're ready for the the final rendering, you can stop the interactive view. But again, this allows you to move around, to look at it from different views. If you change your mind, it doesn't matter. It just re-renders it with the line weights the way you want it. So if you use Make 2D, every time you want it, I know in my world, things always change. So if you pick a certain view of the site and you go through the process of Make 2D and Illustrator, and your professor or your boss says, I really like that from the other side, well, you're going to spend the rest of the afternoon doing that. All I have to do is turn this around this way and re-render it and export it, and it's done. Okay, so this will save you an enormous amount of time and still give you the kind of line weights and actually give you nicer. I've got shading here on the landform, which you would have to do by hand. I've got shadows here. If I want to manipulate the sunlight and shadows, I can include that. I don't have to redo that in Illustrator. This is just so much more flexible and so much more powerful that, and it will just save you time. So if we want to go through the final rendering, I'm going to pull this up, go to my settings, render output. Maybe I'll bump this up to my viewport, and let's make that 3000. And then click on this and let this pull itself up into a full-blown rendering here. Again, it goes through, it does all the shading, does all the colors, and then the last pass it comes back and puts those line weights on. So if you don't like the line weights that I have here, and for this as I'm rendering it, I'm thinking, well, maybe that's not beefy enough, although it's still going through some passes, so it may thicken those lines up as it goes. But really nice shading, really nice colors. You can add simple trees or detailed trees if you have something like these logwork trees to put into it, and get a really high quality output without having to manually put any of those things into it. So use Toon Materials. There's lots of interesting ways. They actually are really useful for other, early concept perspectives as you're working through design ideas. Instead of rendering it photorealistically, you can use Toon Materials and you get outlines. You can kind of combine realistic with more abstract conceptual graphics. It gives you a whole nother range of possibilities for presenting your ideas and for developing your ideas. So use 3D software the way it should be used. Don't go back to making something 2D and redoing things that you've already done. It's kind of one of those cardinal rules of using the computer. If you're doing something by hand manually over and over again, there is a better way to do it, and you need to figure it out. So hopefully this is one of those better ideas that will save you some time. And again, I've demonstrated this in SketchUp, but you can do exactly the same thing in Rhino with V-Ray for Rhino. It works the same way. The principles are the same. All right. Thank you.